Have you ever wondered why being polite, smiling kindly, listening without interrupting, softening your tone, sometimes leads to being misunderstood or even misread? What if that courteous, well-meaning version of yourself is not just seen as nice, but is in fact awakening something much deeper and more complex in the unconscious mind of the man across from you? For many women, especially those raised to be considerate, accommodating, and emotionally intuitive, politeness is a natural reflex. It's not manipulation, it's survival. A conditioned behavior often learned in childhood, reinforced in school, in family systems, and later in romantic relationships. Politeness becomes a social strategy, not to deceive but to protect. But what few realize is how this seemingly harmless behavior can activate unconscious processes in the male psyche, especially when shaped by early emotional voids or idealized maternal figures. Freud would say, "We do not simply fall in love with people, we re-encounter them. That is, we fall for patterns, for familiar emotional climates. And when a woman offers politeness, softness, emotional availability, she may unknowingly mirror the blueprint of perfection he holds inside. A deeply rooted fantasy, shaped not by conscious logic, but by childhood need." Let us pause here, because before we rush to analyze the man, we must first validate you. The woman who's always been so nice, so measured, so emotionally generous. Perhaps you've noticed how often this makes you a magnet for projection. They fall fast, they romanticize, they call you different. And yet soon after, the same politeness that attracted them becomes invisible, or worse, resented. It is not your fault, but it is worth understanding. In Freudian terms, your behavior might be activating an unconscious construct known as the ego ideal, the internal image of what love should feel like, what a good woman should be. This isn't about you, this is about the theater of his mind and the role he casts you in without asking. There is a particular fatigue in being constantly misunderstood, in realizing that your calm, your grace, your attempts to maintain harmony are not being received as you intended. You're not being seen. You're being used as a screen onto which someone else projects their longings, their unmet needs. And when that projection breaks, when reality peeks through, you're left holding the emotional confusion. What if your politeness, rather than being a virtue in the moment, is actually being mistaken for submission, innocence, or even devotion? What if, in his psyche, your softness reawakens the emotional figure he idealized as a child? Not necessarily his mother, but perhaps the one he wished his mother had been. Freud appears here as a kind of interpreter. The past is never dead. It is not even past. His voice reminds us that in human desire, nothing is accidental. Your tone, your manner, your calm presence, these are not just social gestures. In his mind, they might be symbols, and symbols carry weight. They carry memory. They stir the unconscious. Which brings us to an essential insight. Politeness is not neutral. It can soothe, but it can also distort, especially when it becomes a mirror for someone else's internal fantasy. So I ask you, have you ever felt surprised by how quickly a man seemed to attach to you, almost as if he'd known you forever? Have you ever had the eerie sensation that you were being loved not as you are, but as some version of a good woman he imagined, long before you arrived? This is the terrain we'll explore together, not to make you less kind, but to help you understand the emotional forces at play when your politeness becomes more than just a gesture, when it becomes a projection screen. Your practice for today is simple, but revealing. Notice how often you smile to make others comfortable. Then ask yourself, is this who I am or who I've learned to be? We begin here, not to reject kindness, but to reclaim the space between genuine connection and unconscious performance. Every man, whether he knows it or not, carries within him a silent image, a psychic imprint of what he believes the ideal woman should be. This is not about taste, it is not about personality or compatibility, it is something far more intimate and far more elusive. Freud called it the ego ideal, the internalized standard formed early in life, influenced by parental figures, emotional experiences, and unfulfilled needs. It is this ideal that many men chase, often unconsciously. And it is why your simplest gestures, politeness, emotional warmth, attentiveness, may not be received as what they are, but as proof that you are her, the one he's always been looking for, the one who fits the mold. But what exactly is this mold? From infancy, a boy's first emotional lessons are shaped through attachment, through presence or absence, approval or disappointment, attunement or neglect. If his mother was emotionally inconsistent, he might grow into a man who yearns for softness and predictability. If she was cold or distracted, he may become hyper-attuned to kindness, politeness, warmth, interpreting those qualities not just as traits, but as needs finally being met. In this way, politeness doesn't just signal social grace, it touches a nerve. It activates the imprint of the good woman that lives in his ego ideal, the woman who soothes, who understands, who never threatens, who says the right thing. In reality, this ideal is not a person. It is a fantasy born from emotional hunger, and hunger can distort perception. You might be thinking, but isn't it good to align with someone's ideal? The danger lies not in being idealized, but in becoming invisible beneath the projection. Because what begins with admiration can end in resentment, especially when you deviate from the image, when your voice sharpens, when you assert a need, when you stop performing politeness as expected. You might hear, "You've changed," but you haven't changed. You've just become real. Freud would point out that the ego ideal exerts power because it was formed at a time when the child was powerless. It is, in essence, a psychological relic, untouched by reality, untouched by growth. Which is why some men keep choosing the same kind of woman again and again, the one who fits the mold, who triggers the feeling of safety they never quite had. So what does this mean for you, the woman who's always been the good one? It means that your behavior can unintentionally reinforce his fantasy. And if you're not aware, you might get trapped inside a role you never auditioned for. This isn't about changing how you speak or hardening yourself. It's about recognizing that even your softness can be misread through the lens of another person's unfinished story. His attraction may feel intense, even romantic, but it might not be about you at all. Ask yourself, am I being seen clearly or being idealized silently? Is his affection grounded in who I am or who I remind him of? This is the repetition Freud warned us about. The unconscious drive to recreate early emotional configurations in adulthood, even when they cause pain. Your awareness breaks this pattern. A small practice for this week: when someone is overly complimentary, overly fast in their affection, pause and ask, what do they see in me? And what might they be needing to see? Understanding the ego ideal doesn't mean rejecting love. It means staying awake, especially when you feel flattered, especially when your politeness is being turned into something it was never meant to be, a projection of perfection. Have you ever felt that no matter how much you offer emotionally, you are either placed on a pedestal or dismissed as too much? That a man either reveres you or retreats the moment you express desire, opinion, or complexity? This emotional split is not your doing. It's a phenomenon that Freud once described with unsettling clarity: the Madonna-whore complex. Her deeply ingrained psychological split in the male unconscious, where women are divided into two archetypes: the pure and nurturing Madonna, or the sensual and dangerous whore. One is to be loved and respected. The other is to be desired, but never fully embraced as a partner. It's not a conscious judgment, it's a psychic defense. A man who has not integrated his early emotional experiences often cannot tolerate the idea that one woman could hold both tenderness and erotic power. He needs to split them, to protect himself from the discomfort of emotional intimacy and sexual vulnerability coexisting. And here again, your politeness plays a role, the softness in your voice, the way you make space for others, your emotional intelligence. These qualities, so human, so generous, are often interpreted through this rigid binary. Politeness, in this unconscious system, becomes equated with purity. And suddenly, you're not a woman, you're the Madonna, admired, idealized, protected, until you say no, until you want more, until you become real. Then, something shifts. His behavior cools, his desire fades. He begins to withdraw, confused and restless, not because you did something wrong, but because you broke the image. You reminded him that you are not just the fantasy, you are a full human being, and the unconscious is rarely kind to those who break its illusions. Freud might say, he is not reacting to you, he is reacting to the internal war within himself. A war between what he was taught to desire and what he was taught to shame. You are just the trigger. Let's be clear, this is not your burden to carry, but understanding it can liberate you. It can help you stop blaming yourself when you feel the temperature drop in the room, when you sense the reverence turning into resentment. It's not that you were too much. It's that you refuse to be cut in half. Many women, especially those shaped by people-pleasing and relational caretaking, unconsciously lean into the Madonna role. It feels safer, rewarded, less threatening, but it also leads to invisibility. You become adored, but not touched, chosen, but not cherished, worshipped, but not known, and it's a lonely place to live. So, how do you navigate this split? First, you notice it, in his language, in his pacing, in how he responds when you express a boundary, a desire, a challenge. Does he flinch? Does he pull back? Does he suddenly treat you like someone else? Then you name it, to yourself. He's not seeing me, he's seeing an idea of me. You reclaim your complexity. You refuse to perform politeness to maintain the pedestal. You let yourself be all of who you are, sensual and kind, firm and forgiving, clear and soft. You stop trying to fit into a man's fragile binary. Today, write down one sentence. I will no longer dim my truth to remain someone's ideal. Because you are not here to be categorized. You are here to be fully seen, in your light and your fire, in your clarity and your depth. Have you ever sat across from someone and felt that their reactions didn't quite match the moment? That their tone, their intensity, their attachment to you came from someplace far older than your shared experience? This is transference, a concept at the heart of psychoanalysis, and of so many unspoken tensions in romantic relationships. Freud described transference as the redirection of feelings for one person onto another. In other words, it is when someone responds to you with the emotions and expectations shaped by their past, usually from childhood. It is not conscious, it is not deliberate, but it is powerful. And for women who are polite, emotionally available, and attentive, it can become an emotional magnet. Because what you offer, the grace, the calm, the care, often echoes the love someone once longed for, but never received. And so they attach, not to you as a full person, but to the emotional experience you awaken in them. You are not just a partner, you become a symbol, a repetition of the past, with the desperate hope that this time it will be different. Transference is a haunting echo, and when it occurs in romantic relationships, it often brings an eerie sense of familiarity. He says he feels like he's known me forever. He calls me his angel, even though we've just met. He trusts me more than anyone, but also blames me when things go wrong. Because what begins in longing can quickly turn into projection. Let's bring it closer. Imagine this. Your politeness, your gentle tone, your care, your silence when you're hurt, reminds him of how his mother used to soothe him, or how she didn't. And now he pours into you all the unspoken emotions he's been carrying. His desire to be seen, held, forgiven. His anger at not being protected. His fear of abandonment. You become the emotional container, and slowly you disappear under the weight of someone else's history. This is how transference steals your clarity. You start to feel responsible for his emotions. You feel guilty when you set boundaries. You're confused, not because you don't know yourself, but because his reactions don't belong in the present. Freud would urge us to observe the distortion. What is repeated is not remembered. Meaning when a man transfers old emotions onto you, he's not remembering what actually happened. He's trying to resolve it, in you, without knowing he's doing it. But you are not a therapist. You are not a mother. You are not a memory. You are a woman, here now, who deserves to be loved for who she is, not for the comfort she accidentally resembles. The task, then, is not to fix him. It's to recognize the pattern and refuse to participate in it blindly. If you feel that your simple kindness is being overinterpreted, if his expectations seem to swell beyond what the relationship can realistically offer, ask yourself, what role am I playing in his unconscious story? Do I feel free to be myself, or am I performing to manage his emotional reactions? To break the cycle of transference, you must come back to the present, to your body, your truth, your boundaries. You must allow the illusion to collapse. Practice for this week. When you feel overly responsible for someone else's emotions, pause. Place your hand over your heart and say, This feeling belongs to him, not to me. Transference thrives in silence, but it unravels in awareness. You do not exist to repair someone else's past. You are allowed to be seen as yourself, not as someone's unfinished story. Why do so many women feel guilt when they speak their truth? Why does something as simple as not answering a message, asking for space, or refusing to smile carry the weight of betrayal? The answer lives deep inside the psyche, in a structure Freud called the superego. This is the internal voice that monitors, judges, and corrects us. It is the psychological heir to our early caretakers and to the broader culture in which we were raised. It is the echo of "be nice," "don't upset anyone," "a good woman doesn't." And for many women, it is a voice that never stops whispering. From a very young age, girls are often rewarded for being polite, modest, accommodating. These behaviors are not only praised, they are moralized. They are internalized as what makes a woman good, not just pleasant, but worthy. This is where the superego becomes particularly punishing. Because when you deviate from those ingrained expectations, even slightly, it doesn't just feel uncomfortable. It feels wrong. And the most tragic part? You don't even notice the punishment is coming from within. Let's return to your politeness. When you speak softly, listen attentively, and prioritize others, the world around you, especially men who haven't interrogated their own conditioning, reads those actions as moral virtues, not just preferences, but proof of your goodness. And you start to believe it too, until one day you don't want to be so polite. You want to say no, you want to be quiet without smiling, you want to rest instead of caretake. And then guilt rushes in, not because what you're doing is actually wrong, but because you've transgressed an unconscious standard of femininity that has lived inside you for decades as your superego. Freud described the superego as the internalization of societal norms. But he didn't fully name how gendered, how punishing this internal structure becomes for women, especially those who have lived through loss, divorce, emotional trauma, especially those who have fought for their independence only to find that freedom still feels heavy. Because here's the truth, even autonomy can feel like failure when your superego was trained to worship self-sacrifice. So what do you do with this realization? You begin by naming it. Not every uncomfortable feeling is a sign that you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's just your inner conditioning fighting for relevance. You begin to differentiate. Is this guilt, or is this an old voice trying to keep me small? Am I being true to myself, or obedient to a standard I never chose? And slowly, your internal authority begins to shift. Freud would say, the goal is not to silence the superego entirely. It's to make it conscious, to no longer obey it blindly, to see its rules, and decide whether you still believe them. A small but powerful practice. Next time you feel guilt after asserting yourself, whisper this phrase under your breath. This is not guilt. This is growth. Let the old voice speak, but let your adult self answer. Because the woman you're becoming is not a threat to the world. She's just a woman who stopped apologizing for her wholeness. Perhaps now you see, politeness was never just politeness. It was a language, one that spoke not only to those around you, but directly to the unconscious minds of men who were taught to desire softness without complexity, affection without demand, loyalty without resistance. What you intended as kindness may have been received as obedience. What you offered in good faith may have been interpreted as silent consent to an outdated fantasy. And when you finally spoke your truth, asked for more, withdrew from the pedestal, or dared to want something for yourself, the illusion cracked, the spell broke, and the backlash, subtle or direct, reminded you just how conditioned this dynamic really is. But that isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of your liberation. Freud might say, awareness dissolves repetition. Once you see the pattern, once you understand how your smallest gestures awaken entire psychic histories in another, you gain the freedom to choose, not to fix him, not to fight the past, but to remain rooted in the present, where your truth lives. You are not here to be a symbol, not the good girl, not the savior, not the emotional mirror for a man who never learned to love without projection. You are here to be seen, not revered, not feared, but met. That begins when you stop editing yourself to maintain harmony. When you notice your urge to over-explain, to soften the no, to keep the peace, and instead ask, what part of me am I protecting? and from whose judgment. Authenticity will always threaten the fantasy, and that is a risk worth taking, because when a man truly loves you, he doesn't just cherish your politeness, he respects your limits, he stays when the tone changes, he honors your truth, even when it's not convenient. And when he doesn't, when he retreats, blames, or withholds, it is not a sign that you are too much. It is a sign that he was not ready to meet a real woman. A journal prompt for this chapter. What parts of myself have I hidden in order to remain palatable to others? Then, what would it feel like to show up without apology? Silence is also a response, and sometimes your greatest healing. If this conversation stirred something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt like your politeness was mistaken for something else, or used against you? And if you'd like to keep exploring the hidden scripts behind women's emotional lives, subscribe for more reflections. Together we unlearn, remember, and reclaim. You're not difficult. You just stopped settling for less.